Imagine you are standing in the dirt-packed courtyard of a prehistoric village, the year unknowable, but the air thick with the scent of wet clay and wood smoke. Nearby, a child lies silent on a platform of woven reeds, while a circle of men and women prepare sharp-edged stones and hollowed-out bone tools. The wind moves through the reeds like breath, but in this moment, no one breathes. What they are about to do is both sacred and surgical. They will press a blade into the child's skull, twist, and carve until a circle of bone is lifted away like a lid from a vessel. This is not punishment. This is healing. Before we continue, if you're the kind of person who searches for the quiet corners of history, where unspeakable things were done in the name of care, control, or cure, consider subscribing or sharing this with someone who still believes the past was less brutal than the present. And tell us where you're watching from. The past is not dead. It just whispers low. Archaeologists have found hundreds of skulls, most of them small, bearing round or oval holes cleanly cut through the cranial bone. In some, the edges are smooth, signs of healing, proof that the child survived. In others, the bone is sharp, jagged, the whole a final wound. These discoveries are not random. They stretch across continents and centuries, from Neolithic France to the highlands of Peru to Bronze Age Siberia, and suggest one of the oldest forms of medical or ritual intervention in human history: trepanation. But why children? Why these soft heads, not yet fused? Historians do not agree. Some believe the procedures were spiritual, meant to release bad spirits, curses, or madness. Others argue they were medical, treatments for seizures, infections, or head trauma. Still others think they were social, acts of marking, disciplining, or purifying a body thought to be wrong. But in all of these theories, one thing is clear: the children could not choose. They were brought to the edge of life by the hands of others, in the hope that something broken would be fixed by cutting it open. Among the most haunting cases comes from a cave site in southern France. A small skull, dated to roughly 5,000 years ago, bears a precise circular hole on the left parietal bone. The child, no older than 7, had survived. Bone growth along the edges of the hole suggests weeks or months of healing. But the story does not end in relief. Just beside it, a second hole, freshly cut, shows no signs of recovery. This child was trepanned twice, once to heal, once, perhaps, to silence. Some archaeologists believe this child may have been part of an early medical training exercise, that the second hole was practice for another's cure. Others suggest the child suffered seizures or hallucinations and was seen as spiritually touched or cursed. But the truth is unknowable. The child's story, like the hole in the bone, exists only in fragments. Still, from these fragments we begin to see the outlines of something darkly systematic. Not mere superstition, but a ritualized structure of bodily violation in the name of restoration. And we begin to meet the figures who performed it. One such figure is known only by the traces he left behind: a series of consistent tool marks, discovered in at least 12 juvenile skulls across prehistoric Spain. The angle, depth, and curvature of the incisions match. Experts now believe this was a single practitioner, likely a man in his middle years, trained by repetition, who became so skilled that none of the children died from the initial procedure. The modern nickname given to him by researchers is the clean hand, a cruel euphemism for someone whose every act, though precise, brought lasting pain. The clean hand is not remembered by name, but his legacy endures in bone. He was not a monster, likely revered in his community, perhaps even loved. But every child who passed beneath his flint blades carried a legacy not of miracle, but of trauma. To understand why children became the preferred subjects of early cranial surgery, one must look not at the instruments or the rituals, but at the very concept of the child in early human societies, how they were valued, feared, and used. Unlike in modern Western thinking, where childhood is romanticized as a time of innocence, in many early cultures it was a state of vulnerability and permeability, a threshold. Children were seen not as fully formed humans, but as liminal beings, closer to spirits than to adults, more open to possession, divine influence, or corruption. This notion is reflected in burial practices. In one Neolithic grave in what is now southeastern Poland, archaeologists uncovered the body of a girl no older than 10, laid on her side in fetal position. The skull bore a trepanation wound, its edge smoothed by partial healing. But what surrounded her body spoke louder. A ring of animal bones, bird skulls, and polished stones arranged in a tight circle. According to experts, this was no simple grave. It was containment, a ritual designed to bind whatever had been opened inside her and prevent it from leaking into the world beyond. The surgery, then, was not only to heal the child, it was to heal the community, or protect it. We also know, through forensic analysis, that these surgeries were not done in moments of panic, but with planning. In the Andes, in a village that once lay along a sacred trade route, 12 juvenile skulls were found beneath a layer of volcanic ash. 9 had trepanation wounds, only 3 showed signs of survival, but all of them showed signs of preparation. Shaved bone edges, smooth entry points, and, in 2 cases, traces of resins or herbs placed inside the cranial cavity before sealing. These were not butcherings, they were structured interventions. From this structured violence emerged several historical figures, not in name, but in role. One of them was likely a mother. Anthropological evidence from the Romanian Carpathians suggests that some of the trepanations were performed by women, especially in matrilineal clans, where midwifery and medicine fell under the same role. In one site, a woman's skeleton was buried with tools traditionally associated with healing: obsidian blades, ground herbs, and a polished deer antler used for cauterizing. Next to her, in a shallow grave, lay the skull of a toddler with a clean circular hole. Experts suggest the woman may have performed the procedure or been honored for trying. Her presence complicates the story. This is not a tale of brutal men cutting into helpless children. It is a story of communities, of families, of women and men caught in cycles of care and control, where the boundary between mercy and mutilation was thin and shifting. It is here we encounter the second antagonist of our story, not a person, but a belief system. A worldview that saw suffering not as random, but as meaningful, where illness in a child could be a sign of ancestral anger, divine punishment, or impurity of the bloodline. In such a world, the solution was not to comfort the child, but to extract the perceived cause, sometimes through holes in the skull. Even the pain itself had a purpose. In some cultures, the child's endurance was seen as proof of their strength or potential transformation. Survival marked them as chosen. Death confirmed the presence of something too dangerous to let live. This brings us to one of the most disturbing motifs in the archaeological record: the reopened skull. In multiple sites across Eurasia, researchers have found skulls that were trepanned more than once, sometimes in different locations, sometimes reopening the same wound. According to historians, these were not acts of failure, but of persistence, as if the first opening had not been enough, as if the child needed to be accessed again. The act of reopening a skull speaks to something profound and unsettling, that within these societies, There existed not only a tolerance for inflicting repeated trauma, but a belief in its necessity. The child was not the subject of healing. The child was the site. It is in this notion that a child could serve as a vessel for communal anxiety, spiritual correction, or symbolic cleansing, that the third and most elusive figure emerges. Not a surgeon, not a priest, but an interpreter, the ritual translator, the one who named the sickness and prescribed the blade. Across cultures, this figure appears in traces, in the incantation marks burned into bone tools, in the ochre-stained stones found beside graves, in the etchings of concentric circles carved into cave walls that mirror the shape of a hole in the skull. In early Celtic Britain, archaeologists unearthed a site where animal bones and human skull fragments had been carefully arranged into spiral patterns. Among them was the partial cranium of a child, estimated to be around 6 years old. The trepanation was not in the expected location, not on the parietal or frontal bone, but in the center of the skull, directly atop the sagittal suture. This placement would have risked death instantly. There were no signs of healing, but nearby, engraved onto slate, was a series of runic symbols that scholars believe to be an invocation or charm. Some believe this child was part of a ritual sacrifice meant to open a path to the divine or appease a restless spirit. This figure, the interpreter, was both feared and trusted, endowed with the authority to say, "This child carries a burden." And in doing so, they reshaped the child's body to reflect that judgment. Not with cruelty for its own sake, but with conviction. That is the quiet horror of their role. Belief as blade. Contemporary historians refer to this phenomenon as instrumental childhood, the idea that children, particularly in pre-modern societies, were not only social beings but social tools. Their bodies could be used to mark cosmic boundaries, to absorb communal guilt, or to test medical hypotheses without recourse. The child did not yet speak for themselves, and so others spoke through them. And sometimes, what they said was terrible. In one of the most shocking finds from the highlands of modern-day Turkey, a group of trepanned juvenile skulls were found arranged in a ring inside a ceremonial pit, each set carefully on smooth stones, with herbs packed inside the cranial cavity. Radiocarbon dating placed them all within the same generation, perhaps even the same decade. Local oral traditions refer to a period of spiritual unrest, when multiple children in the village were believed to have been touched by unseen forces, their behavior erratic, their sleep disturbed, their eyes wandering into the distance. In modern terms, some researchers suggest epilepsy or neurological disorders. But in the cosmology of the time, the explanation was simpler: possession. The pit may have been an exorcism ground. The children, vessels. This legacy is not isolated to one culture. Similar burial rings appear in early Mesoamerican and West African contexts, though the methods differ. Some pierce, others scar, others tattoo or burn. The constant is the belief that the body of the child is malleable, open, and capable of carrying more than its own soul. What is striking in so many of these records is the absence of resistance. Not because it did not occur, but because it was not preserved. The archaeological record does not keep screams, or shaking hands, or the moment a mother held down her own child, believing she was saving him. It keeps only holes. The hole becomes the record. The record becomes the proof. And yet, in the attempt to cure or control, what these early practitioners created was a legacy of wounds, literal and symbolic, that outlived the children themselves. The clean hand, the mother healer, the ritual interpreter, all became parts of a system that believed it could master the spirit through the skull. But spirits are not so easily silenced. And the skull, even broken, remembers. By the time metal tools replaced flint, the practice of trepanation had not disappeared. It evolved, from ritual act to experimental medicine, from spiritual extraction to anatomical intervention. But the body of the child remained central. In ancient Greece, Hippocratic texts described the procedure as a last resort for skull fractures or swelling of the brain. Yet even in these more rational contexts, the line between medicine and metaphysics blurred. Healing the head still meant opening it. What changed was the justification. Where earlier societies invoked spirits, the physicians of classical antiquity invoked humors, imbalances of bile and blood, wind and phlegm. The hole in the skull now served as a release valve, a portal through which the poisoned interior could be expelled. But the trauma remained the same. It is here that we find one of the earliest documented medical trepanations performed on a child. Recorded not in oral tradition or bone, but in writing. A papyrus from Roman Egypt, fragile and incomplete, describes a boy of 9 years brought to a healer with visions and fire in his mind. The prescribed remedy: let the bone be opened on the 3rd day. Let the vapor escape. No mention is made of the child's consent. Only the technique matters. Only the vapor. Historians argue that this represents the medicalization of a much older belief that something unseen dwells within the skull, and that pain must be inflicted to drive it out. Whether spirit or steam, the logic remains. Suffering is a pathway to clarity. By the early Middle Ages, trepanation was still practiced in monastic infirmaries, often under the sign of Christian exorcism. The child was no longer just cursed. They were sinful, tainted, and needed purification. In the vaults of a monastery in southern Germany, human remains were discovered beneath the altar. 2 small skulls, both with rough, overlapping trepanations and markings of crude cautery. One had a hole the size of a coin, the other a gaping absence where the crown of the skull had been lifted entirely. Nearby, a wooden tablet inscribed in Latin read, "Sanatio per cruciatum," healing through torment. Here, the hole becomes not just a wound, but a form of theological punctuation, a child's pain rendered holy. This merging of doctrine and intervention marks a turning point. For centuries, the act of trepanation had been about healing something unseen, whether a spirit, a sickness, or a curse. Now it began to serve another purpose: control. As centralized powers emerged, religious, imperial, medical, the child's body became a proving ground not just for beliefs, but for authority. Who had the right to open a skull? Who could name what was wrong inside? The act of cutting was no longer communal. It became sanctioned. And as the procedure became rarer in official records, it persisted in folk medicine and hidden practices. The village healer, the mountain midwife, the silent heretic who kept the old ways alive. In isolated corners of the Balkans and Caucasus, skulls continued to bear the telltale marks of trepanation well into the 16th century. Always on the young, always with the same blend of precision and desperation. The motif of the sacred wound returns here, not as cure, but as mark. A hole to signify that the child has been changed, that something has been removed or inserted. Some anthropologists believe these acts served as social thresholds, a way to symbolically transform the child from one state to another, sick to healthy, impure to pure, human to sacred. But for the child, there was no symbolism, only the sharp edge, only the silence that came after. It is this silence that modern scholars now struggle to interpret. In academic terms, they speak of bioarchaeological evidence, mortality outcomes, post-cranial pathology. But beneath the metrics lies a deeper question. How many children were opened? Not out of necessity, but out of belief? And how many simply never closed again? By the Enlightenment, trepanation had fallen into disrepute among most physicians in Europe. Advances in anatomical knowledge, skepticism of folk practice, and the emergence of modern surgery pushed the act of skull opening to the fringes of medical legitimacy. But the child's skull, soft, incomplete, ever symbolic, remained a site of obsession. In Parisian medical schools of the 18th century, instructors dissected the heads of orphaned children to study the effects of hydrocephalus and cranial infection. Trepanation was no longer a treatment. It became a tool of discovery. The body, long considered a vessel for spirits or humors, was now simply material, and the child, a specimen. Records from the Hôtel Dieu Hospital describe experiments in which doctors inserted probes into the opened skulls of infants, observing how they reacted to light, pressure, and cold. One surgeon wrote of a remarkable twitching of the limbs in a child whose cranial plate had been removed, and wondered whether this could illuminate the origin of volition. There is no mention of what became of the child. He is listed only by a number. This is the final transformation of the whole, from exorcism to experiment, from sacred opening to clinical incision. And yet, beyond the laboratory, the old motives endured. In parts of colonial Latin America, indigenous communities continued performing trepanations on children, not under the gaze of science, but as part of ancestral rituals. Spanish missionaries condemned these practices as demonic, yet often borrowed their techniques when treating battlefield wounds. In this contradiction, suppression and imitation, the legacy of trepanation became a mirror. It showed how little had changed. Even in the modern age, echoes persist. In early 20th century asylums in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, lobotomies were sometimes carried out on children deemed uncontrollable. Though no longer called trepanation, the mechanics were similar. Open the skull, alter the brain, close it again. The language was updated. Therapeutic intervention, behavioral correction. But the logic was ancient. Cut the child to cure the world. It is here, in this convergence of eras, that we reach the climax. Not one moment, but an accumulation. Thousands of skulls, thousands of children, spanning millennia. Each one opened with conviction. Each one leaving behind a hollow that no theory can fully fill. The final antagonist in this history is the idea of necessity. The belief, deeply held, even by the gentlest hands, that suffering is required. That the child must endure pain to be made whole, or to prove their worth, or to answer for something no one else can see. Necessity rationalizes the wound. It gives shape to cruelty. It lets the cutter sleep. And so, across centuries, the act of drilling into a child's skull has been justified by gods, by ghosts, by humors, by science, by order. What none of these justifications account for is the child themselves, their fear, their pain, the heat of the stone or blade against a head too small to understand why. Experts today can measure the angles, catalog the tools, chart the survival rates, but they cannot recover the sound of a child crying out in a language no longer spoken. They cannot translate the silence that followed. Only the whole remains, a perfect circle of belief. In museums and archives around the world, small skulls rest quietly behind glass, each bearing the unmistakable sign, a hole, circular or oval, sometimes smoothed by healing, sometimes jagged by death. Visitors pass by them quickly. They pause longer for jewelry, weapons, masks. The human skull, especially a child's, resists the eye. It demands something else. a recognition that what we are seeing is not just a body, but a decision. Someone chose to open this head, and someone believed it was right. Historians today argue over the meaning of these acts. They catalog the locations: Peru, France, the Caucasus. They analyze the mineral content of the tools. They reconstruct surgical techniques in labs, demonstrating with 3D printed bone how a blade might have entered without piercing the dura mater. But none of these reconstructions address the truth that hangs behind it all: that the violence was intentional, and it was intimate. The cutting of a child's skull was not impersonal. It was done by hands that often knew the child. Hands of mothers, fathers, elders, priests. In some cultures, the act was considered an honor, a chance to lift the veil between sickness and spirit. In others, it was a desperate attempt to prevent death. And sometimes, it was simply an experiment, a way to learn more, no matter the cost. Modern medicine condemns these acts as barbaric. And yet, in our own time, the idea remains that a child's body can be altered without their consent for a greater good, whether through surgery, correction, or sacrifice of a different kind. This is not a story about ancient ignorance. It is a story about how pain becomes tradition, how belief, even born from care, can justify harm, how the body, especially a small one, becomes the battleground for ideas too large to bear. In the end, the story of trepanation is not just about what ancient doctors did. It is about what they were willing to do. To open a skull is to cross a line. To do so again and again, over centuries, is to build a civilization on the other side of that line. The children whose skulls were opened cannot speak, but they are not forgotten. Their silence is not empty. It is full of breath held, of wounds survived, of rituals remembered not by words, but by bone. If you've stayed with this story, you already know that history is not kind, and it is never quiet. It waits beneath the surface, like a scar, like a hole, until someone dares to look. And now you have.